if you have a pot, people don't think that the pot is, and people understand that if you smash the pot up into bits and then make it up into smaller bits, that it's not like there's not any, pot that's left. It's just like something that we call a bunch of non-pot things. But even when you understand that, is that the same as like, okay, now we realize there are no pots at all? Is that really the same? I mean, that's the question, right? Does understanding that pot doesn't exist just in and of itself as a pot, does that mean that there aren't any pots? Or it just means that pots exist as long as you don't look into it too deeply? Right. Okay. So, in this way of talking, though, I mean, the idea is that there are two sets of objects of knowledge, two kinds of things that exist. Conventional things and ultimate things. And you get the Pitraputra Samagama Sutra, the Meeting of the Father and Son Sutra, Mahayana Sutra, says objects of knowledge are exhausted, comprehended within the two, conventional realities and ultimate realities. Oh, now it's like, oh, these are things that exist. There's conventional things that exist and ultimate things that exist. Oh, that's in the Mahayana Sutra. And then that gives you a sense that at least there is not, I mean, and of course in the Abhidharma way too, there is this thing, and it's not necessarily they're saying that when they say ultimately when we look for the pot or the person, we don't find the pot or the person, we find just these little tiny dharma bits that are flickering around, and and the person is something that's imputed by thought. Is that really the same as saying that there aren't any pots? Oh, look, think of the questions of Melinda, right, where he asked Nagasena. And it's like you came here in a chariot, and when we look for the chariot, we'll just find all these like chariot parts. Does that mean that the true teaching of Buddhism, as represented by the monk Nagasena, is that there wasn't any chariot at all? Obviously, he knows that there was some conveyance by which the king has arrived at the scene of interacting with the monk. You see what I'm saying? So it's like there's some things that are there, but then when you look for them very closely and say, what is it really? There's nothing to hold on to. And then there's something else, which is what you find when you ask that question, how are things really? And those are two kinds of things. There's how things are really, and then there's how things just are before we look into it too deeply. and that works. Like it's like, a chariot is different from a jaguar, and a red jaguar is different from a blue jaguar. And you're just like, these are things, that you don't find out when you say, what is it really? Because when you say, what is it really, you always find its unfindability. There's nothing ultimately there to grasp. So, a way to think about this, like two kinds of things that exist. Instead of like just, I'll tell a story to the kids to help them become more enlightened way. We're the kids, right? There's this other thing, and say, well, there's two kinds of things that exist. And some things, and one way to think about that is the distinction in Tibetan between how things appear and how things ultimately exist, or how things ultimately are. And you can say that what you find when you look into things deeply and say, what is the book really? What is Guy really? What is the Abbey really? And then what you know with your mind at that time is how these things exist. You know how their ultimate mode of abiding. You could say their ultimate way that they exist. But that's not necessarily everything that's possible to know about them. Have if you know that the Abbey is ultimately unfindable, you still wouldn't know like how to get to it, like driving directions. That's like different kind of information. Yeah, but when I analyze those driving directions, there's no such thing as left or right. Yes, that's true, but how are you going to get there? So there's like, do you see what I'm saying? There has to be like a kind of you just feel that there must be some kind of okayness or some kind of, at least obviously usefulness. Now one even wants to say legitimacy to our stupid kind of baby talk, because without it, we'd never make it to the Abbey. There's no, you know.
Isn't that dangerous though?
I'm sure. I don't know, but you could elaborate, and I'll see.
Well, it's my opinion that non-human doesn't actually really care if the truth is going through it. It really cares about their suffering and attachment. And so everyone here has had modern figures somewhere in their head, but they know things don't exist the way they do. And we already, we know that we were raised on that. We were brought up on that. That the ultimate nature of this table is not just is not what I see. The ultimate nature of the table, according to physics, is what movements of energy. I mean, we already know that, but that doesn't do anything about our attachment.
Well, I think Nagarjuna is following the Buddha in saying that when you understand that, deeply that things have no graspable nature, then you're freed from grasping, and that does solve your attachment. Okay, so no ultimate nature means that, like, well, when you, I don't know how the modern physics that you studied in high school is, but it's like, it's like if it goes to the level of saying, oh, these things look to be solid, but that's a false appearance, and really it's vibrations of energy, and say, well, really, what is that energy, and so forth. You have this problem of saying, well, what do we mean by energy? I saw, what's his name? You know who Feynman is? If you're talking about Richard Feynman, I saw him on YouTube the other day, and somebody said, why do these magnets attract each other? And he's like, I can't explain it to you. He said, it's electromagnetic force, and that's like a basic thing, irreducible concepts of the universe, and there isn't some more fundamental thing that you understand better than magnetism. You understand magnetism is that this is how this works, but there isn't any other thing that's like deeper than that you will be able to understand, that I can use to explain it to you. And I was like, oh, it's like, so there's this idea is like, well, I don't know if you follow physics from the point of view of Newsweek magazine, or even in Scientific American, it's like, well, the newest thing is there was strings, and they were supposed to be one-dimensional, and they made up the quarks, and now I hear that the latest thing is maybe these strings, lo and behold, aren't really one-dimensional after all. I was like, it never made any sense at all that there could be an object that constituted the universe that had no thickness whatsoever. It's like, well, I'll stack up a lot of them, I'm sure. But so now it turns out maybe they're not really one-dimensional. So, well, so if a string that's what we mean by energy, is a string that makes up a quark, that makes up a subatomic particle, and what makes up the string is that if it goes from here to here, then it has a north, south, east, and west. So that's like, Nagarjuna is saying there isn't anything that is of a fundamental nature. When you analyze, you have all these categories, and they all fail to sustain. This is most of the chapters of the Karikas, right? Just take apart everything that everybody. What people were thinking Nagarjuna's Karikas are written in the context of the Abhidharmas. Abhidharmikas, and these people believe that, just like we were saying, that the person is just something that's named. It's just a mere imputation to a collection of but their concept was very clearly, look, since the things we're attached to are mere imputations, that's going to free us from our attachment. But we can't say that there's nothing that's at the bottom of it. There has to be something that is real. Like you're saying, there's some fundamental energy. In the Abhidharmas, they called it like the dharmas with a small d, right? We do in English. But they had catalogs of what are the irreducible bits, and they could be irreducible bits of experience. Like 81 different kinds of mental states, or there could be like irreducible bits of matter. But anyway, there's irreducible bits. To me, it's like quarks and strings and whatever they come up with next is like these like bits. It's like the Abhidharma, they're like Abhidharma dharmas. And the point isn't to get, it's true, things don't exist as they appear, but the idea is that there's nothing that's at the ground of it absolutely. And you realize that there's nothing at the ground of this absolutely, then the idea that is, for Nagarjuna, that utter ungraspability of anything, anywhere, right, is what frees you from your attachment, because there's nothing to be attached to. That's what I was trying to say earlier, like, it's not a matter of telling people not to be attached, even though there are some really subtle things that they haven't heard about that they could be attached to. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, if you're attached to the wrong thing, if you're attached to people, you should be attached to strings. They're one-dimensional. You know what I'm saying? No.
I just wanted to bring that up because the way, what you were saying, the way you were saying, the things that you were saying was, because our mind is really sticky. We want to grasp on something, and everything is here in Dharma. We go over and our mind tries to figure out a way to make it the same as everything else. Make it so we can continue being who we are and where we are.
Yeah. Oh, so what you're saying, I think I get what you're saying. You're saying if I say that there's some legitimacy or okayness in the conventional realm, then this has a confirming of our ordinary way of perceiving things. Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with you. This is not just a theoretical problem. I think you can observe that this has been a real problem with our tradition, that with the lineage from J. Rinpoche, is that, I mean, when you find, high lamas saying, don't think the fact that things have conventional valid existence means that the way you see the world now is right. Why do they say that? Because they know that's what people are doing and need to be told not to do, right? And it's like, it's a balancing act, right? The middle way is like this thin ridge. And you find different people in different generations, using different language to teach, in a different context, to try to push a little one way or push the other way. There's no mistaking the fact that for Nagarjuna, he thought that you really needed the Abhidharma tradition was holding on to some svabhava, some intrinsic nature. It wasn't holding on to svabhava of a person, but he's saying once you hold on to svabhava of one thing, then that ramifies outward and you really haven't understood the profound emptiness of anything. And so he was really pushing in that direction, okay? And by and large, the thrust of the Perfectional Wisdom Sutras is like that also, okay? But J. Rinpoche, was writing most of his important books in the first couple decades of the 15th century, and he's in a completely different context. So he can say, in good faith, I'm telling you what Nagarjuna really meant, but say it in a way that really sounds like it's pushing the other way. Well, because he's pushing back against, a situation in which he feels like things have gone too far the other way in Tibet. It's a problem. It's a practical problem, because we have both of these tendencies in our society and within ourselves all the time. I think maybe partly behind your comment is that the innate fundamental problem is one of exaggerating or reifying things, right? And so it's really crucial that you have a Dharma system that challenges our sense of how things ordinarily appear. Yeah. Okay, I follow what you're saying now, thanks. Yeah. So if there's... Those comments notwithstanding, if there is some sense in which conventional things do have some kind of existence, albeit not the kind of existence that we ordinarily take them to have or attribute to them, but if they're not completely canceled out or obliterated when you understand the nature of things, then it's not really a matter of like first you start at the conventional step and then that's superseded as you go up to the ultimate step and then you meditate on that and then you become liberated. It's more that things exist, and these conventional things that have a way of existing, which is the ultimate. So the ultimate and the conventional is like, the ultimate is what we call the way that conventional things exist. It's also the way it itself exists. But it's not just like floating freely, emptiness existing in an empty manner in and of itself, apart from what? Apart from everything. No. What's the base? What is empty? What's empty? What is empty? It has to be... emptiness is empty, yeah. Is that the only thing that's empty? Well, if you think that's the only thing that exists, it's the only thing. It's just empty in and of itself, self-existent emptiness existing in and of itself emptily. Is that what we really think? Now, maybe, but frankly, no, it sounds like a joke, but, I think that this is what some Tibetans before Je Rinpoche, not all of them, but some really thought that. They thought exactly that. They thought exactly that. Everything is made up by delusion, completely and entirely. And all Buddhism is a story or a dream that is an illusion that we construct in order to free ourselves from the illusion that anything has any existence other than sheer emptiness. And you end up with something that's sort of, I don't know, like, well, what happens when you're enlightened? You're not like, there's no idea of a pure land, there's no pure conventional, there's no form bodies, it's like, these things are just, there's no internal landscape of an enlightened being. Right? Because there isn't any consciousness. That itself is an illusion, except if you're going to say consciousness itself is the ultimate reality, right? That's another whole idea that other people have. So I think this is the direction. There's a basis in Buddhist history for this direction that Tsongkhapa teased out and focused on, and that is to say, look, conventional things exist, and because they're the basis of emptiness. And he says, this is in, I guess we say in English, illumination of the thought, Gompa Rapso. He said dong shi, dong chi. There's like the conventional and the ultimate is like there's the quality of being empty and there's the basis of emptiness. Okay. Well, as soon as you said that, you're just saying, well, emptiness doesn't exist in and of itself. There's an interrelationship between emptiness and the basis of emptiness, and this is grounded in the teachings of Nagarjuna, but not in Mula Madhyamaka Karika. You have to look to get it very clear, I think, in Essay on the Mind of Enlightenment, which is Bodhicitta Vivarana, and this is a text that is attributed to Nagarjuna, and people not everybody agrees that it's really written by Nagarjuna. His Holiness teaches it as, according to the tradition, as one of Nagarjuna's books. And it says, just as sweetness is the nature of sugar, and hotness is the nature of fire, so we assert that the ultimate nature of all things is emptiness. Reality is not to be seen as something different from this. Okay? It's not something different from the fundamental nature of things. I've been thinking about that in relation to the Heart Sutra. We chant the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. It's not saying, yeah, emptiness is emptiness, but you stupid fool, think of it as form. It's like form is emptiness. Why did you say form is emptiness and then everything is emptiness? It didn't say form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So it's sort of saying, well, there's a way in which emptiness is the way that everything exists, and everything includes a lot of things besides emptiness itself, right? So that means there's something that exists besides emptiness. That's my point. So once you have something, emptiness isn't, conventional reality isn't just a fiction that's created to help stupid people. It's the stuff that exists in the world that lacks the quality of existing in and of itself. Now, as soon as I say exists in the world, you're like, oh, now you have it existing. It's not enough. It's like, so a lot of people say, like, I read Andy Carr's book, what's called Contemplating Reality. It's like a Kagyupa version of what I was trying to do in Introduction to Emptiness. And he won't say that things exist. He say things appear constantly, just for the reason that you're saying, This always seems like, because exist, Exist in of itself. What are you talking about? That's the same. If something exists, it's there. It's got some, like, to make it be there, right? And so how do we tease those apart? It's like we're not really equipped to. And since right now, we have the data and we have the faculties, but we haven't developed the capacity to tease apart what it would mean for something to exist in of itself and what it would mean for it to just merely exist. And since those things just seem enmeshed totally, then that's the problem. As soon as you say that things exist, people are saying, thank goodness that's what I said. That's what we say. I was so worried. I thought you told me they didn't before. Now I find out it's really okay. And it's like, who is it? The fifth Dalai Lama? He had this, I can't remember which text that in, where he says, it was Dendalf Laramba, and he says, well, you shouldn't think that emptiness is just, though the intrinsic nature is something extra. It's like, oh, well, we knew everything was fine. Then you told us about this intrinsic nature thing. It was like a horn or a hat stuck on top of her head, a dunce cap. And then you said, oh, don't worry about that. We knock it off. That's a refutation. Now we're back to normal again. I feel so relieved. Yeah. And of course, that's exactly right. That's the big problem. Yeah. But of course, there's a reason for taking that risk, and that is that nihilism is really not is a serious problem within. It was a serious problem within Tibetan Buddhism at the time that J.R.M. Rinpoche was teaching, and I think really how did the Gelugpa order arise? It arose because, how did it, and I don't mean just because you had this genius, right? But how did it become so thriving, successful as an institution, become like, the dominant group in Tibet? It was because, people were really inspired by these teachings to seriously take vows and take up the practice and take up the study in a deep way. And you say, well, that's very nice, they had a great yogi teacher and they wanted to follow him. Yeah, but there were other great yogi teachers before, too, But what Tsongkhapa did was he said, here's a way that I can tell you that keeping your vows, practicing seriously, is compatible with emptiness and tantra. These are not like things that's like, oh, these vows are just for kids. But then, when you get to emptiness and tantra, you'll see how much better it is, You see what I'm saying? And he had to eradicate that. And but because of the degree of success he had in that intellectually, I think was the foundation for the flourishing of the order. Yeah. Okay, so that was last little quote from Chandra-kirti. I think this kind of like fuses the paradox here of like things are real, all these different kinds of things exist, but then some seem to be more right than others in some way. In his Madhyamaka Avatara, the supplement to the Nagarjuna's treatise, chapter 623. One translation says, Buddha said all things have two entities, those found by perceivers of reality and those found by perceivers of falsities. And another translation of the same thing, all things bear two natures that are constituted through correct and false views. Okay, that's just different ways of saying the same thing, this nature or entity. So there's like two aspects, two dimensions, two natures, two entities, whatever that is, two bits within each bit, and somehow, and one of these is constituted as an object, right, because it's seen by minds that are correct, and one is constituted as an object through being seen by minds that are somehow false and deceptive. Okay, so this cuts both ways right down the middle. Because one thing, you're saying there's two kinds of objects that apparently exist, need to be enumerated, explained, discussed at some length, and what follows. Right? So it's not just that there's one thing and then there's a bunch of stupid people who have this other idea. No, there's these two things. But in the very same moment that it's telling you about these two things, It's telling you that one is constituted through being the object of people who are seeing stuff wrong. And one is constituted by virtue of being the object of people who are seeing stuff right. And it's like, well, why don't we just go with the one that's seen by the people who are seeing right? That was what we told you before, you just stick with it's just a stepping stone. It's like, well, that's what's interesting. Chandra-kirti was saying there's these two entities, two natures, right? But he has one that exists by way of being the object of those who are seeing incorrectly, one that exists by way of being the object of those who are seeing correctly. Now, obviously, when Tibetans Chandra-kirti became huge in Tibet. There's a lot of people who are saying these days in the academic world, but Chandra-kirti was never such a huge thing in India as we who follow Tibetan tradition think. But he was a huge thing in Tibet, for sure, whether he was big in India or not. And everybody had different understandings of what that meant. Some people will read that passage, and they'll say, they'll go exactly with, there's like really these ignorant minds that confabulate conventional truths, and the whole point is to eradicate those ignorant minds and therefore be liberated from the realm of death. Longzomba, for example. And then on the other hand, you have, Jai Rinpoche will come along and say, there's these two kinds of things that exist. And it's true that some are objects of perceivers of falsities or false perceivers, but that doesn't mean that the objects they see are completely non-existent. It means there's something false about the way they're seeing those objects. And Chandra-kirti wouldn't have talked about it if they didn't exist at all. Okay, all right, so let's come back to the original question. So the conventional, you have people, suffering, compassion, the Buddha, the path, all the things that are listed in the Heart Sutra, all these, as like, this is empty, this is empty, this is empty. All these things are the conventional. And these are like the practices. We have to engage, we have to perceive suffering, we have to perceive people, persons, living beings, right? In order to do the practice. If we just see everything as empty all the time, how are we going to do that? And on the other hand, when you say, but what are these things really? What are they, if we see them aright, if we see them as they really are, then we only come down to emptiness in the end. Like the Samyutta Nikaya passage, there's no case in truth there's no case in truth whereby we can say one thing is this and one thing is that. So the purpose, the meaning, the value, the usefulness of the two truths is that the history of the Buddhist effort to make the two wings of the bird, that's the method and wisdom side, be coordinated, make them both able to work, make them so that they're not fighting against each other, make them so that when you're meditating on compassion, you're not going away from emptiness and saying, aren't I a good person to have, to care for those other people, or taking everything as real. And when you go on the emptiness side, your motivation for doing that and the understanding that grows out of it is something that doesn't destroy everything else in the universe and render it utterly non-existent as a kind of complete delusion, whereby everything becomes senseless, right? How can you reconcile those two things? So, I think, as I said briefly at the beginning, I had two quick ways to think about it. And one is to say, to say the two truths are in some sense a second-order teaching. They're a teaching about the teaching. Emptiness and compassion, taking in this. I'm just making this up, right? This isn't from some book. It's like emptiness and compassion, are first-order teachings, and say distinguishing the interpretable from the definitive, distinguishing the three turnings of the wheel doctrine, the two truths. I would say making this up. This is the third-order teaching. I'll call those second-order teachings because they're teachings about how to understand the practices The two truths is not like a fundamental practice. It's a way to get your practices to not be defeating one another, right? So that's why she would have a problem. It's like if she reads a teaching about non-harm, or a teaching about generosity, or teaching about how to relate to the spiritual teacher, or take refuge in, all these things would have like some practical bearing in a way that like something intellectual like the two truths would not seem to have immediate relevance to her. And a very suitable topic for an academic professor such as myself in that way. I mean, frankly, in that maybe it's suitable in the sense of being attracted to it, maybe not suitable in the sense of being most helpful. But that's one way to think about it. And another way, which we can't miss, is this framework, which I find extremely useful from thinking about, Buddhist presentations in terms of, I don't know how you say here, basis, path, and fruit, or, what you start with, what you do, and where you get. Right? Shilam Dre. And it's like, so this is a way of organizing, teachings of any system, and say, what do they say exists? What do they say you're supposed to do? When, how, in what order, and how will that change you? And then what will happen if you do that, right? So this is actually like a really good rubric to use. I've been teaching my students who are writing papers to do nothing to do with Buddhism whatsoever, to steal that idea. Because in one way you can say, well, she, the basis, that includes everything. Like everything that exists is in the first one, right? But it doesn't. It comprehends the Buddha and the path are all things that exist, so they're all part of the basis in that sense. But you're just talking about how they exist and what things exist, and that's not a recipe for what you're supposed to do or a description of what you'll attain. And then the other sort of focus on, given that this exists, what should we be doing, and how should we be practicing, and then where will it lead? Well, if you think about it this way, it's very easy. I mean, it's obvious. And this is always the explanation that I've heard over and over again. It's like, well, the two truths is the basis. You don't expect it to be the path. You don't expect it to be the lam, the practice. This is the way we talk about what exists, what kinds of things there are in the universe, and to how they relate to each other. And if you want to talk about that being the case, what should we be doing to transform our minds into being the best that they possibly could be, right? Then you're talking about the practice of the path, and you're saying, well, what is the best they could possibly be that I could attain to by doing those practices? Then you have the fruition, right, or Buddhahood. And then when you think about it that way, then you can see all kinds of interesting things about, how, and that are implicit in what I've said before. That is, you have to have both truths. And Tsongkhapa makes this argument, quite a bit. He says, if you go like that and argue about emptiness in a way that, from his point of view, implies nihilism, that everything is completely empty and therefore there's nothing that we can say that exists. Talking about anything exists is a mere delusion, and is a function of the ignorance that traps us in the realm of death. If you go like that, then how are you going to be a Buddha? Because you will only have one wing on the bird. You will not have the practice of method. You will not have compassion. You will not have generosity, because they're contradicted by your view, which says none of these things exist, right? So, the method side of the path, the compassion-related activities require an understanding of how conventional phenomena within the basis are not wiped out by emptiness. Right? You have to protect them from annihilation, right? From wisdom to wisdom. Understanding emptiness is like a raging fire that destroys our ordinary way of seeing the world. But if it has to have a break line. I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but right, you have to have a point where you say, yeah, but it doesn't destroy any kind of existence of things at all altogether. It destroys any kind of existence such as I had previously imagined it up to this time. But is there something that's left? And it doesn't not turn out that what's left is just enough to work with, is all we really need, is all that was ever there in the first place. Yeah, that's the idea. Okay, questions? Yes.
Conventional reality established by way of ignorance and what happens if we actually realize the Mahayana idea. What happens to the internal reality?
Very good. Yeah, this is an excellent question, right? That's the way it reads in Chandra-kirti. It's true that when, as this teaching develops, and if you follow what J. Rinpoche says and what all his followers have said about this, they distinguish between pure and impure conventional phenomena. And that's one thing that's important. So the idea is that the kinds of things that appear to us now appear to us in the way that they do, and come into existence, you could say, under the influence of karma and afflictions that existed in the past. That's true. But that doesn't mean that no conventional phenomena exists from the point of view of an enlightened being. So they have the idea that because the Buddha has practiced compassion on the path, that this culminates in a form body as well as a truth body. The practice of complete practice of the path, you have an enlightened being who resides in a pure realm in which there is not simply or only emptiness in all directions, but which there are pure forms. So that's one thing. They distinguish between pure and impure conventionality. So a pure realm manifests itself through as the you could say long-run outcome, in a sense, of the practice of the accumulation of merit on the path, and not through karma and its afflictions, the way our impure appearances do. Okay, so they say that. It's not a very philosophical answer, but it's important anyway to understand that. But then, in addition, the idea is that because Buddha's omniscient mind sees all things that exist, it sees all of us who exist, and it sees also what we see from the point of view how we see it. It's hard. This is where it gets really tangled. You have to read chapter 12 of my book. It's just really a mess. When you try talking about how the Buddha perceives the world within the Gelugpa system, it really gets very complicated. And it's not just for them. I think everybody has some problem in sorting out, how to make all the philosophical categories line up with omniscience. And in fact, the Indian texts talk about this. They say, well, this is inconceivable. The categories, there's things that are manifest and things that are slightly hidden, and then there's the things that are shindogokyo, extremely hidden. How a Buddha understands things is like way harder than understanding emptiness. It's like emptiness turns out to be in the relatively easy category, right, compared to that. But okay, so the idea is that we are seeing all these kinds of, I see the trees and the mountains and so forth. And so these are constituted as objects from the point of view of being objects of my awareness, right? They exist interdependently with my mind right at this moment. So how would Buddha not know that if Buddha's omniscient? And all these objects, all these things have to appear. But it's not like the Buddha has some karma or afflictions that are still operating that cause from within the Buddha's own continuum, these mountains to manifest. It's just that if they exist as objects of, as objects of my consciousness, they're constituted by being objects of the perceiver of the false. The Buddha's seeing all beings and everything that's in their mind, then all these things, all these objects appear, everything that exists appears to the Buddha, and these things exist. They exist as fruitions of our karma. That doesn't mean it's not that they don't exist. So they don't come into consciousness from the point of view of the Buddha still having some hangover or memory of having been in cyclic existence. But it's like, it's a culmination of wisdom to be able to know everything that exists, including things that are, gain their entity or are constituted as existing through their interaction with minds that aren't all the way enlightened. That's the best I can do, sorry. Yeah.
He was describing what he saw that their grandfather comes on the children training, and the children get caught up in their game, and the suffering becomes very real to them. The grandfather, plays with them, plays with them, that's kind of forgetting. It's just like, that's one of the common stories.
I hadn't heard this story, but it's like, it's suitable, right? It's good.
He actually plays as though he believes the game is them, and he looks at him and he's doing what they're doing.
But his mind is also at a completely different level. He's seeing the whole framework within which the game is operating.
And seeing what they're all stuck.
Right. That's very good. Right. It doesn't, the point, what's nice about that is it doesn't destroy the game.
Yeah.
That's the point I want to say. It doesn't destroy the game to know that it's a game and that other people that you're playing with don't know it's a game. It doesn't mean there's no game.
And you can even engage in the game in order to do this compassionate thing.
Yeah, I like it. It's very good. That's what I had in mind as far as introducing the two truths. And what I was going to say I was going to do in the afternoon was basically tell you what Tsongkhapa said about it. The sort of short version, if that's possible. And then that will, we'll then go back and look at what some of the other systems say, and then we'll come back and do Tsongkhapa's in more detail. That's what I had in mind. Okay? Is that suitable? Yes. I do have them. Whether I have them in front of me at this moment or not is a different question, but we have them either in the cabin or in my computer in Mount Pleasant, so I can send you those. Because they're going to be, it's going to be published, so we had to, it's all properly footnoted. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of nice, isn't it, that passage? I think it's good to, bring and I think it's in the spirit of His Holiness, to bring a fresh mind to these, to Buddhist teachings that are, outside our lineage, and not just be motivated by, some kind of bias in how we look at them. And, the idea that, for example, there's no teaching of profound emptiness outside Mahayana is like, well, let's not be so sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.